Dear friends, I can tell you something. I know a lot more about foolishness than I do about wisdom. I practice a whole lot more foolishness than I practice wisdom. When I taught philosophy, I was very impressed with some of the ancient philosophers, and Plato in particular moved me. And one of the things that Plato often said, and any of you who have had an introductory course will know this is true, to know the good is to do it. I used to think, boy, that was so interesting, so all we had to do was gain knowledge, then we'd have understanding, and then our behaviors would all change. It's not quite that easy, is it? Isn't it true that all of us know something that is good and should be done, and we're not doing it? Or don't we all know that there's something that is worthwhile, that really is intelligent, if you will, that reeks of wisdom, but we haven't given much time or paid much attention to allow that which is outside us to become a part of the man or the woman that we really are? And so it's curious that the Scriptures would talk about both foolishness and wisdom. And note, if you will, that this discussion relates to something very specific, and that has to do with the meaning of the cross of Christ. No one could walk through the reality of Lent without dealing with the cross of Christ. And so you and I, each and all, in our own way, are called, first of all, to tell the story of Christ, to tell the story of the cross. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be preacher-like. It needs to be the way you see the story of Christ and the cross. We can all say he was born in a very special way. He was a pretty interesting child and had an unusual childhood. At the age of 30, he began to preach, but he was never content just to preach. He had to touch, he had to heal. He had to be inclusive when other people were exclusive. You can sort of draw the list yourself. At the age of 33, he ran into trouble with the religious authorities first, even though the reality was that it was the political authorities that should have caused him grief. And he ended up being crucified at the age of 33. He had a ministry, 1 3-year appointment, and that's all. And yet somehow or the other, the world knows him. There was a letter written by an ancient believer just after the crucifixion of Jesus, and it went like this. Listen to this letter. My dear Archytas, I write you this letter as a new believer in a man called Jesus. They call him the King, and the only throne that he ever had was a cross to which he was nailed, and the only crown he ever wore was a crown of thorns. And yet somehow I believe that somewhere, someday along the way, the world will come to understand the import and the wisdom of this man who lived to die and who in dying rose to live again. My love to you, Gaius. We need to tell that story not in Gaius's way, but in our own way. This is a very personal part of our history here. When I came to Wells Church, right here, where there is a cross, there was a very large picture of one of the pastors that had served this church. A really large picture. And what's funny about it was he had been killed in a tragic automobile accident. His name was Jim Wells. This church named for him. Some of you know the story. I want to repeat it. He was buried at Baldwin and Lee when it was still right over here on Manship. It was just Baldwin then. A retired mortician came out of retirement because he knew Jim and loved him, and he said he had done hundreds of funerals. And Jim Wells was the only person he ever buried with calluses on his knees. I want you to think about that. And so maybe it's understandable that when I walked in to be the pastor of Wells Church, there was his picture. And so I said to the leadership, I said, you know, I don't want to start off on the wrong foot. I believe preachers have to earn the right to say things. I think you have to love people. I think you have to be with them. But it just seemed to me to be wrong. And so anyway, we had the discussion, and there was the replacement, of the picture with the cross. And then what we did is, you can look at him on the way out. Most of you don't even know who that is in that picture, right there by the stairs. We had that picture reduced to a proper size, and one of his very favorite sermons was ascending to God one step at a time. And I think that's an interesting story, so we got him right there by the stairs. He would have been the first person to say, put the cross of Christ up, take the picture of me down. You know why I'm saying that? When we preach the cross, when we tell the story of the cross, it redirects our central attention from ourselves to others. If there's anything that the cross means, it's that. And so the second thing is tell the story in your own way, but then it will open doors that you never thought it could open. A simple story of telling how your faith works, what your faith means to you, how your faith ministered to you in a time of crisis, how you have felt that you were crucified, or at least hung up to dry and sort of sent out to pasture in one way or the other. And as you begin to tell that story, it will open doors for other people to be able to hear and to begin to share what it is that's going on in their mind and what's going on in their heart. I think of the kids that we've had a chance, dear PJ and I, to be a part of across the years. And I think again of Carol, who died with pancreatic cancer at such a young age. And we had this ministry. Some of you will remember the story at the VA hospital. And they eventually sent us to the back ward. And in the back ward were some of the more terribly wounded men and some of the more mentally affected of the patients that they had. And there was one guy who lost this whole side of his face in a mortar attack. And he would always sit in the back and never take part. And they were having a little dance. And Carol was this real cute blonde. And she said, "Who's he?" And the nurse said his name. And she said, "Why isn't he dancing?" And he said, "Oh, he won't. He's too ugly." And she said, "I'm going to dance with him." And he said, he won't dance with you." And she said, "Yeah, he will." So she went over there, and she asked him, and he shook his head no. And I don't know what she said because I didn't hear it, but I did see her get on her knees, this 18-year-old senior in high school, and hold her hand out to him, and him put his hand in hers, and him get out on the dance floor and try to cover his face with one hand. And he said, "Why would you want to dance with me?" And she said, "Because of the cross of Jesus." And he said, "I don't understand that." And she said, "Neither do I, but it's why we're dancing together." The wisdom of the cross sometimes supersedes the wisdom of the world. I was listening the other day to the preacher talking about string theory and quantum physics. And I want you to know that I looked it up so I could give you a clever summary of that. But isn't it curious that in a world like ours, with all that we have learned, that somehow or the other the cross still comes across to us, and the way it's presented to us is in preaching. And what we poor preachers try to do is to say somehow or the other, some way or the other, God who loves us came to us in this person of Jesus, who lived and who eventually died for the likes of us. And he died for the likes of each of us, and he speaks to each of us from that cross. And that cross somehow towers over the wrecks of time, lifts its image, and presents its power. We were having a meeting of the kids, the high school kids, and I said to them one time, "What's the meaning of the cross?" And one of the boys said this: "When my family broke up, and when my grandmother died, and when my favorite aunt died within the same month, the cross became God's plus sign to me." I said, "What do you mean a plus sign?" He said, "Well, every cross looks like a plus sign." And I said, "But what does it mean?" He said, "It means that in all that I had thought that I had lost, there was still more. There was the plus sign." And so the next time you feel a little negative about the cross, remember that plus sign, because it will open doors of understanding, doors of wisdom, doors where foolishness is put down, and somehow another wisdom is lifted up. Another way of communicating is brought to us. The foolishness of preaching. It's interesting because the world is much, much more technical, and we're much more... I went to lunch last week. I'm not going to point to any of you, but I went to lunch last week, and a couple of the guys that I love a lot, one of the guys was over there with his head down, and I thought he died or gone to sleep. But anyway, what he was doing, he was texting. That's fine. You know, it's really great. But in a world where the technology enlarges itself and expands itself on a daily basis, it almost seems ridiculous to say that preaching still reaches the human heart. But somehow or the other, it does. Somehow or the other, it reaches the human heart. I remember a little old preacher that was assigned to a church, and he couldn't preach worth a lick. And they just loved him to death. And they said, well, how in the world could you love him if he's your preacher and he can't preach worth a lick? And they said, because he loves us first, and then whatever he says makes sense. Isn't that the word of the cross? The God who loves us first. And whatever the complex difficulty of understanding a 33-year-old man who's supposed to be the Son of God getting nailed to some Calvary somewhere, and to believe that somehow or the other that is a part of the answer and salvation of human souls, really is amazing. But it's also true. And so, finally, and the last thing is all, let it touch your own heart. Let your own heart be touched, perhaps made whole. One of the songs that I love to hear us sing is, now rest my long divided heart. Rest on this blissful center rest. One of the powers of the cross is it keeps us from being schizophrenic and draws our brokenness and our lack of wholeness back together again. And with that in mind, I'm going to close with another well-known story in the life of our church, but it's kind of one that I think sort of sums up what we want to say today. We were down having coffee in the fellowship hall, having a good old time. It was actually a little bit earlier than usual, so we were visiting with one another. And a girl came in with the biggest Bible you have ever seen. And she was a very sweet girl, very well-dressed, attractive girl. And she said, I need to know where the preacher's Sunday school class is. And I said, well, I'll be glad to show you. And she said, because I understand that preacher really needs what I'm bringing today. And I said, well, it's right over there. That's where we were still meeting, down where the Christ and Culture class meets. And she said, and not only that, but everybody in this church needs what I'm bringing today. And I thought, what is it, this 10-pound Bible? Isn't that terrible? I shouldn't have thought that. But it was the biggest, darkest. It was a big Bible. Anyway, when we got into the class, we had the little opening prayer, and then she said, put her hand up, and we said yes. And she said, I want you to know something, and I want you to hear this clearly. Everybody got real quiet. Jesus died on the cross to save us from our sins, and you better know it. And the whole class. And so we started making the announcement again, and she held her hand up and said, did you hear what I said? And then she repeated it again, more distinctly. Jesus died on the cross and saved us from our sins. And one of the guys sitting over there was new to the class. He's not in the class anymore, but he was there then. And he said, before you say that again, I want to ask you something. And she looked at him very strangely. And she said, what? And he said, what in the world does that mean to you? He said, the truth is, I wanted to be a little bit more refreshed in my language, but I'm not. Just tell me what in the world that means to you. She said, it means Jesus died on the cross to save me from my sins, and you need to hear it. My preacher told me that. He insisted. What does it mean to you? I asked you. And she said, it means Jesus died on... I never thought about it, she said. And I really don't know. And then she said, what does it mean to you? And this husky kind of a guy started crying. Probably didn't need to say anything more. But then he went on and he added, he said, I don't know how to tell you this. He said, it's not fancy. It's not intelligent. It's just that when Jesus was on that cross and he said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. I heard him call my name. And when he called my name, I knew God loved me and my sins were forgiven. In the world, there is foolishness and there's wisdom. And the wisdom of God and the strength of God and the power of God makes a lot of our wisdom look foolish and a lot of our foolishness look very wise indeed. Bless God. Amen.